Steve Jobs was born in San Francisco on February 24, 1955. His parents were unmarried at the time. Steve's biological father was from Syria, and since Steve's mother's father did not approve of his daughter marrying a Syrian, she put Steve up for adoption. Steve was adopted by Paul and Clara Jobs. At the age of 5, Steve's family moved to the Silicon Valley. There his father built him his own workbench and taught him the basics of electronics and how to build things on his own. Later, Steve met his neighbor, an electronics hobbyist, that introduced him to the Heathkits. They were unassembled, basic electronic devices that the user would construct with the use of a manual as a guide. As a teenager, Steve cold called Bill Hewlett, a man that Steve looked up to, and managed to not only secure parts from HP, but to also acquire a summer job assembling parts. During the summer before Steve's summer year, he was introduced to Steve Wozniak, or Woz as he was called. Woz and Steve started off by building an advanced digital blue box, a device that allowed people to trick phones into providing free service by emitting certain frequencies. Steve and Woz turned the device into their first business, by selling to college students. The cost for each blue box was about $40, and they were sold for $150. Of course, the blue box devices were illegal, and eventually Steve decided that he didn't want to risk getting caught, so he stopped production. In 1972, Steve enrolled in college and then dropped out in the same year. According to him, he didn't see the value in it. He didn't know what he wanted to do with his life, and he didn't see how college was going to help him. And college was also consuming all of his parents' savings. Steve took a job as a technician at Atari Inc., working for $5 an hour. Steve saved up enough money to travel to India. He returned from India as a Buddhist. He spouted a shaved head and was wearing traditional Indian clothing. During this time, Steve experimented with LSD, which he later credited as a major reason for his success. Steve and Woz began attending the Homebrew Computer Club, which was started to get people together to make computers accessible for everyone. It was because of this that they learned about the NET, Intel, and Motorola processor chips. This resulted in Woz trying to design his own machine around the chip, which then turned into Steve and Woz starting Apple in 1976. Ronald Wayne was the third founder of Apple and the person who came up with the first Apple logo, but he left early on. The Apple computers grew in popularity very quickly. By 1979, the Apple II had made the company $139 million in sales. In 1981, they went public, and in 1983, Steve convinced the CEO of Pepsi-Cola, John Sculley, to leave and fill the CEO position at Apple. In 1984, Apple released its famous 1984 Super Bowl commercial, which introduced the Macintosh, which became the first commercially successful small computer with a graphical user interface. An industry-wide sales slump near the end of 1984 resulted in a deterioration between the working relationship of Steve Jobs and John Sculley. A power struggle ensued, which resulted in Steve Jobs being removed from his managerial duties and then him resigning from Apple 5 months later in 1985. After he left, he founded NeXT Computer in 1985 with $7 million. He later attracted attention from Ross Perot, who invested $20 million in the company. Although there weren't many NeXT computers sold, the company was not a failure, and parts of the operating system went on to be used in iTunes and Mac OS X. In 1986, Steve purchased Pixar from George Lucas for $5 million. Pixar started out as a high-end computer hardware company. The computers didn't sell well. To compensate for this, Pixar started creating animation for outside companies. Pixar made a deal with Walt Disney to produce 3 computer-animated feature films, the first one being Toy Story. Steve considered selling Pixar to Microsoft as late as 1994, after having sunk over $60 million of his own money into the company. Once Disney confirmed the distribution deal on Toy Story, he decided to give it another chance. The film ended up grossing over $350 million, and Pixar went public in 1995, making Steve Jobs an instant billionaire. Apple acquired NeXT for $430 million in 1996, and the year after, Steve Jobs returned to Apple as an advisor and became chief executive again in 2000. Steve significantly increased sales by introducing the iMac, an entire computer system contained in a CRT display. Steve bought Apple into the digital music business by introducing iTunes, and then the iPod MP3 player. On June 29, 2007, Apple entered into the cellular phone business by introducing the iPhone. In 2003, Steve was diagnosed with a tumor located in his pancreas. Instead of going with a normal medical treatment, he opted to go with an alternative medicine diet before eventually going through a procedure that appeared to successfully remove the tumor. In August of 2006, Steve delivered the Apple keynote at WWDC. His gaunt appearance resulted in speculation about his health, despite an Apple spokesperson claiming that Steve's health was robust. On August 28, 2008, Bloomberg mistakenly published an obituary of Steve. He responded by quoting Mark Twain with, "Reports of my death are greatly exaggerated." In April 2009, Steve underwent a liver transplant, and on January 17, 2011, Apple announced that Steve Jobs had been granted medical leave, and that Tim Cook would be running Apple's day-to-day operations while Steve would still be involved in major decisions at the company. Steve Jobs made his last onstage Apple appearance at the WWDC keynote on June 6th and introduced iCloud. On August 24, 2011, Steve Jobs stepped down from Apple, stating that he could no longer meet his duties and expectations as Apple's CEO. Steve Jobs died in his California home at age 56 on October 5, 2011, due to complications from his relapse of his previously treated pancreatic cancer. The announcement of his death resulted in a massive response from the online and media world. Over 10,000 tweets per second were sent discussing his death, the biggest online reaction of any event in history. You might not like Steve Jobs as a person, or care for his Apple products, but there is no denying the fact that he was a visionary and that his ideas have changed the world.